Part 1. The morning started like any other morning on New Haven Colony. Children walked to school with their backpacks. Parents kissed them goodbye at the doors. Teachers prepared their lessons for the day. Nobody knew that in 6 hours every single child would be gone. New Haven was a peaceful place. 12,000 humans lived there, farming and building homes on a planet far from Earth. The colony had been there for 15 years. People chose to live on New Haven because it was quiet and safe. There were forests and rivers and clean air. It was supposed to be a good place to raise children. Commander Jack Palmer ran the colony's security force. He had 30 people working for him. They carried basic weapons and mostly dealt with small problems, broken equipment, lost hikers, minor disagreements between neighbors. Palmer had been a soldier once back on Earth, but those days seemed far away now. New Haven didn't need soldiers. It needed people who could help their neighbors. That morning, Palmer was drinking coffee in his office when the alarms went off. His computer screen showed 5 large ships entering the planet's atmosphere. They were not human ships. Palmer felt his stomach drop. He grabbed his radio and called his team. Unknown vessels approaching. Everyone to stations. This is not a drill. He ran outside and looked up at the sky. The ships were massive, bigger than anything the colony owned. They moved slowly and deliberately, like they had done this many times before. Palmer's hands shook as he tried to contact them on the emergency channel. Unknown ships, this is New Haven Colony. Please identify yourselves and state your purpose. The response came in perfect English, but the voice was strange, not quite human. We are the Creathian Empire. We are here to conduct a legal harvest under Galactic Council Regulation 2847. Do not interfere. Palmer didn't understand. Harvest? What did that mean? He tried again. Please explain your intentions. We are a peaceful colony. Notification was sent to your government 72 hours ago. We are within our legal rights. Prepare your youth for collection. Collection. The word hit Palmer like a punch. They were here for the children. He immediately sent an emergency message to Earth, but he knew the truth. Earth was weeks away. Whatever was going to happen would happen before help could arrive. The Creathian ships landed near the colony's main buildings. Doors opened and beings walked out. They looked almost human, but not quite. Their skin had a gray tint. Their eyes were too large. They moved with mechanical precision, carrying devices Palmer didn't recognize. Palmer gathered his security team. 30 people with pulse weapons that were meant for hunting animals and scaring off predators. He looked at their faces and saw his own fear reflected back. They all knew what those ships had come for. Many of them had children in the colony. We have to try, Palmer said. His voice was steady even though his heart was racing. We have to protect them. His team nodded. They took positions around the school and the residential areas. When the Creathians approached, Palmer stepped forward to block their path. You can't have them, he said. These are our children. The Creathian leader looked at Palmer with those large, emotionless eyes. Council law permits genetic collection from pre-industrial and newly spacefaring species. Your species joined the Council 40 years ago. You are subject to these regulations. We didn't agree to this. Nobody told us you could take our children. The regulations are 3,000 years old. Ignorance does not grant exemption. The Creathian raised a device. Before Palmer could react, a wave of energy swept through the area. Palmer tried to move but couldn't. His body was frozen. He could see and hear and think, but he couldn't move a single muscle. Around him, his entire security team stood like statues. The Creathians walked past them toward the school. Inside the school, Lisa Morgan was teaching her class of 20 students. They were learning about Earth history, about the old countries and the wars that happened before humanity reached the stars. The children were focused on their tablets when the door opened. Lisa looked up and saw the gray-skinned beings walking into her classroom. She knew immediately something was terribly wrong. She stood up and moved in front of her students. Get out, she said. Her voice was shaking but firm. These are children. You can't be here. The Creathians ignored her. One of them raised a device. Lisa felt the energy wave hit her. Her body locked up. She couldn't move. She could only watch as the Creathians moved through her classroom, picking up each child like they were collecting packages. The children screamed and cried, but their small hands couldn't fight off the aliens. Lisa tried to scream. She tried to move. She couldn't do anything. Tears ran down her frozen face as her students were carried away. The same scene happened throughout the colony. The Krethians moved through every building systematically. They had maps. They knew exactly where every child was. Parents watched helplessly as their sons and daughters were taken from their homes. The neural dampeners kept everyone frozen, unable to fight back or even follow. The Krethians worked for 6 hours. They collected every human under the age of 16, 2,300 children in total. They loaded them onto the ships with efficient, practiced movements. This was clearly not the first time they had done this. When the ships finally lifted off, the neural dampeners deactivated. Palmer collapsed to his knees. Around him, his security team fell to the ground crying. The paralysis wore off slowly, but the horror didn't fade at all. Parents ran through the streets screaming their children's names. Lisa Morgan sat on the floor of her empty classroom, staring at the desks where her students had been sitting just hours ago. Their tablets were still there. Their backpacks hung on their hooks, but the children were gone. Palmer forced himself to stand. He went back to his office and checked his computer. The message from Earth Command was there. It had arrived 5 hours ago. It said, "Warning received. Fleet dispatched. To 78 hours. Hold position. 78 hours." The ships had taken the children and left. Help was coming, but it was too late. Palmer sat down and put his head in his hands. He had been a soldier once. He had fought in battles and seen terrible things. But nothing had prepared him for this. Nothing had prepared him for watching children be taken while he stood frozen, unable to protect them. Outside, the colony descended into chaos. Some parents refused to believe their children were really gone. They tore through their homes looking for hiding places. Others sat in the streets holding their children's toys, rocking back and forth, making sounds that weren't quite human anymore. By nightfall, the truth had settled on everyone. The children were gone. The aliens had taken them legally. The Galactic Council, the organization humanity had joined hoping for peace and cooperation, had regulations that allowed this, laws that were 3,000 years old, written before humans even knew other species existed, permitted aliens to harvest their children. Palmer stood in the colony's central square and looked at the crowd of parents. They looked at him with desperate eyes, waiting for him to say something that would make this better. He had nothing. No words could fix this. No orders could bring the children back. But as he looked at their faces, Palmer saw something else starting to form. Not just grief. Not just despair. Something harder. Something colder. The same thing he felt building in his own chest. The Krethians thought they had followed the law. They thought humans would accept this because it was legal. They didn't understand what they had just done. They had miscalculated badly. Palmer sent one more message to Earth Command. It was short. They took all of them. Every single child. "What are your orders?" The response would take hours to arrive. Palmer already knew what it would say. Humanity was about to remind the galaxy why they were called the most dangerous species in known space. Part 3. The Wellington caught up with the Krethian convoy 3 days after leaving New Haven. Captain White brought his ship to a stop just outside weapons range. 5 Krethian vessels hung in space ahead of them, moving slowly toward their home system. They weren't running. They weren't hiding. They clearly believed they were untouchable. White's orders from General Morrison were clear. Observe and follow. Do not engage until the main fleet arrives. The general was 6 days behind them, with the full might of Earth's military. 6 days to plan, 6 days to organize, 6 days to do this properly. Lieutenant Baker was monitoring the Krethian ships from his sensor station. He had been tracking them for days, learning their patterns and analyzing their systems. What he found made his hands shake as he typed his report. "Sir, they're modifying their cargo holds. I'm detecting medical equipment powering up. Surgical tools. Genetic sequencers." White felt his stomach drop. "They're starting procedures." "It looks that way, sir." White stared at the tactical display. The Krethian ships were shown as 5 red dots. Inside those ships were 2,300 children. Human children, and the Krethians were already beginning whatever experiments they had planned. 6 days. General Morrison's fleet was 6 days away. In 6 days, how many of those children would still be alive? How many would be changed beyond recognition? White had read the reports about Krethian genetic research. They were masters of biological manipulation. They could alter a being at the cellular level. Change memories, modify behavior, rewrite what it meant to be human. He looked around his bridge. His crew was watching him, waiting for orders. They all knew what the regulations said. Wait for reinforcements. Don't start a war by yourself. Follow proper military protocol. White opened a communication channel to the Krethian flagship. The alien commander appeared on his screen, looking annoyed at the interruption. This is Captain Danny White of the Earth vessel Wellington. Release the children immediately and surrender your ships. This is your only warning. The Krethian commander's expression didn't change. You have no authority here, human. We are in council space operating under legal mandate. Withdraw your vessel or face charges of harassment and intimidation. I'm giving you one chance. Let them go. Your threats are meaningless. You are one small ship. We are protected by council law and council military forces. Leave now. The Krethian commander closed the communication channel. White sat back in his chair. He thought about his daughter back on Earth. He thought about Lisa Morgan sitting in her empty classroom. He thought about Commander Palmer frozen and helpless while children were taken from his colony. Then he thought about regulations and proper procedure and waiting 6 days while children were experimented on. Lieutenant Chen, target their engines. His weapons officer looked up in surprise. Sir, you heard me. Target their engines. Disable those ships. Captain, our orders are to wait for the fleet. I know what our orders are. I'm giving you new ones. Target their engines. Lieutenant Amy Chen hesitated for just a moment. Then she began programming the weapons systems. Around the bridge, the crew moved with sudden purpose. Everyone knew what this meant. They were about to start a war. The Wellington was classified as a light cruiser. It was designed for patrol work and escorting convoys. The Krethian flagship was a heavy research vessel with full military shields and council-approved defensive weapons. On paper, it wasn't even close to a fair fight. But humanity had been preparing for this moment. Every weapons system on the Wellington had been quietly upgraded over the past weeks. Technologies that pushed council regulations or broke them entirely. The magnetic accelerator cannons had been modified to fire at twice their rated power. The torpedoes carried experimental warheads that council scientists said were theoretically impossible. White gave the order. Fire. The Wellington unleashed everything it had. Magnetic rounds tore through space at incredible speed. Torpedoes streaked toward the Krethian vessels with warheads that burned hotter than stars. The first salvo hit the Krethian flagship's shields and shattered them like glass. Explosions rippled across the flagship's engine section. The Krethian commander had 3 seconds to realize he had miscalculated badly. Then his ship's power core went critical and tore the vessel in half. The other Krethian ships tried to scatter. They activated their own weapons and returned fire. But White's task force had been waiting for this moment. 3 more human ships dropped out of faster-than-light speed and joined the attack. They swarmed the Krethian vessels with a ferocity that shocked the alien crews. The space battle lasted 20 minutes. White had trained his entire life for combat, but he had never fought with such focused rage. Every shot was for the children in those cargo holds. Every torpedo was vengeance for New Haven. One by one, the Krethian ships went dark. Their engines destroyed, their weapons offline, their shields collapsed. They drifted in space, helpless and defeated. Cease fire, White ordered. Baker, scan for life signs. All of them. Lieutenant Baker ran his sensors over the damaged vessels. I'm reading multiple human life signs in the cargo sections. Also detecting Krethian crew in various parts of the ships. The flagship is a total loss. The other 4 are damaged but stable. White opened a channel to his Marine commander. Helen, take your team and board those ships. Find the children. Secure any Krethian crew you find. And Helen, if you find anyone conducting procedures on those kids, you have my permission to use whatever force necessary. Commander Helen Price had been waiting for those orders. Her assault team launched within minutes. They breached the Krethian vessels with cutting tools and explosives. Price led from the front, her weapon ready, her team behind her. The first ship they boarded was filled with research equipment, laboratories and holding cells. But no children. They moved to the second ship. Same thing. Research facilities, but empty of prisoners. The third ship was where they found them. Price and her team breached the cargo section and stopped in their tracks. The room was filled with medical equipment, genetic analyzers, neural mapping devices, surgical tables, and on those tables, connected to machines with tubes and wires, were human children. Price had been a Marine for 15 years. She had seen combat on 4 different worlds. She thought she had seen every terrible thing war could produce. She was wrong. Some of the children were awake. They stared at the ceiling with empty eyes while machines extracted samples from their bodies. Others were unconscious, their small forms surrounded by monitoring equipment. The Creathian medical staff stood frozen in surprise as armed humans burst into their laboratory. "Secure them," Price said. Her voice was cold and hard. "All of them. Anyone who resists gets shot." Her team moved through the room with practiced efficiency. They stunned the Creathian medical staff and carefully disconnected the children from the machines. Medical personnel from the Wellington arrived and began triage. Some of the children needed immediate care. Others were physically unharmed but psychologically damaged in ways that would take years to heal. Price found the research logs on a computer terminal. She read through them and felt sick. The Creathians had planned extensive procedures for all 2,300 children. Full genetic harvesting, neural pattern extraction, cellular modification. The notes were clinical and detailed. They described children like they were lab specimens, objects to be studied and used. None of them would have survived, Price said to her second-in-command. The procedures would have killed them all. They searched the other ships and found more children. Some were already undergoing procedures. Others were in holding cells waiting their turn. The boarding teams worked for hours, moving from ship to ship, securing every child they could find. By the time they finished, they had recovered 240 children alive. All of them needed medical attention. Many had been permanently changed by what the Creathians had done. The procedures couldn't be fully reversed. Captain White stood in the flagship's medical bay after it had been secured. He looked at the equipment and the research notes. He read about the procedures that had been planned. Lieutenant Baker was beside him, equally horrified. They were going to process all of them. Baker said quietly, "This was never about research. This was about harvesting them like resources." White sent his report to Earth Command. He included everything. The footage from the boarding, the research notes, the medical evidence, the children who had been saved and those who had been lost. Then he prepared himself for the consequences. He had just attacked 5 ships belonging to a Galactic Council founding member. He had violated multiple treaties. He had used prohibited weapons. By council law, he had committed an act of war, but he had also saved 240 children. 3 days later, General Morrison's fleet arrived. The general listened to White's report in silence. He reviewed the evidence. He walked through the captured Creathian vessels and saw the laboratories for himself. Then he looked at White and nodded. "Good work, Captain." Those 3 words meant everything. White had broken regulations and ignored direct orders, but he had done the right thing. And Earth was backing him completely. The Galactic Council convened an emergency session. The charges against humanity were severe: unauthorized military action, destruction of Council member vessels. Part 2 Captain Danny White was preparing his ship for a routine patrol when the emergency signal came through. The Wellington was a light cruiser, designed for escort duty and border monitoring. It had a crew of 200 and carried enough weapons to handle pirates or smugglers. Nothing serious, nothing that would prepare them for what was about to happen. The message from Earth Command was marked Priority 1. White read it twice, certain he had misunderstood. A colony harvest, Creathian Empire. 2,300 children taken. He felt sick. Plot a course for New Haven, White told his navigation officer. Maximum speed. Sir, that will burn through our fuel reserves. I don't care. Do it. The Wellington jumped to faster-than-light speed within minutes. White sat in his command chair and read every report he could find about Council harvest regulations. The words made him angrier with each paragraph. The laws were ancient, written when the Council first formed. They allowed founding member species to collect genetic samples from younger species for scientific research. The regulations used careful language about preservation and advancement, but the reality was clear. Powerful species could take what they wanted from weaker ones. Humanity had been part of the Council for 40 years. In all that time, nobody had mentioned these harvest rights. Nobody had warned them that their children could be legal targets. White's communications officer, Lieutenant Chris Baker, was working frantically at his station. "Sir, I'm picking up similar reports from other human colonies. 3 more incidents in the last month. Smaller numbers, but the same pattern. They've been doing this for a while," White said quietly. "We just didn't know." The trip to New Haven took 78 hours. It was the longest 3 days of White's life. He kept thinking about his own daughter back on Earth. She was 12 years old, the perfect age for a Creathian harvest. If he had been stationed at a colony instead of on a ship, she might have been taken too. When the Wellington arrived at New Haven, White saw a colony that looked normal from orbit. Buildings intact, power running, no damage. But when they established communication with Commander Palmer, White heard the truth in the man's voice. Something fundamental had broken down there. White took a shuttle to the surface. Palmer met him at the landing pad. The commander looked like he hadn't slept since the harvest. His uniform was wrinkled and his eyes were hollow. "Show me everything," White said. Palmer took him to the security office and played the recordings. White watched the Creathian ships land. He watched Palmer and his team get frozen by the neural dampeners. He watched the aliens walk through the school and take children out of their classrooms. The footage was clear and detailed. The Creathians hadn't tried to hide what they were doing. Why would they? It was legal. White felt something cold settle in his chest. He had been in combat before. He had seen people die, but this was different. This was organized, systematic, done with paperwork and regulations. Where did they go? White asked. Tracking shows them heading toward Creathian space. They're not running, moving at normal speed. Because they think they got away with it, White said. He returned to the Wellington and sent his report to Earth Command. He included all the footage and Palmer's testimony. Then he added his own recommendation: immediate military response. On Earth, the government received White's report and dozens like it. The news spread fast. Within hours, every human on every planet knew what had happened. Parents held their children closer. News networks showed footage of empty classrooms and grieving families. The public reaction was instant and unified. Get them back, whatever it takes. Admiral Susan Hayes called an emergency meeting of Earth's military leadership. The room filled with generals and admirals, all of them watching the footage from New Haven. Nobody spoke for a long time. Finally, Secretary of State Karen Phillips broke the silence. "We have to go through proper channels. File a protest with the Council. Demand they change the regulations." General Frank Morrison slammed his hand on the table. The sound echoed in the quiet room. "File a protest?" "They took our children to use in their laboratories. Every parent on Earth is watching us right now. If we respond with paperwork, we'll never be trusted again. If we respond with violence, the Council will expel us. We'll be isolated, sanctioned, cut off from galactic trade and technology. Then we'll be isolated, but we'll have our children back." The argument continued for hours. Some wanted diplomatic solutions. Others wanted immediate war. The debate was fierce, but everyone understood the stakes. This decision would define humanity's place in the galaxy for generations. President Laura Bennett listened to all sides. She was young for a president, only 50 years old. She had 3 children of her own. After 18 hours of debate, she made her choice. Issue the mobilization order. Every ship, every soldier, every weapon we have. We're getting those children back. The room went silent. Everyone understood what she had just done. Earth was going to war with a Galactic Council member. They were breaking treaties and ignoring regulations that had stood for 3,000 years. There would be consequences. Nobody cared anymore. Within 2 days, Earth's military began the largest mobilization in human history. Shipyards stopped building civilian transports and started building warships. Research facilities began weaponizing technologies they had developed for peaceful purposes. Factories retooled to produce ammunition and armor. The Council sent warnings. Ambassador Kyle Rogers stood in his office reading the formal protests and demands. The Council wanted humanity to stand down. They threatened sanctions and expulsion. They reminded Earth about the regulations that governed Council space. Rogers sent back a simple response. "We're coming for our children. Anyone who stands in our way will be removed." The Galactic Council had never received such a message from a member species. There was confusion at first. Surely the humans would back down when they understood the consequences. Surely they would accept the loss and file proper protests through legal channels. But Earth kept mobilizing. Ship after ship launched from human space. The fleet grew larger every day. 42 warships within the first week. More coming behind them. The Creathian representative, High Scholar Venth, appeared before the Council to defend his empire's actions. He was calm and confident. The harvest had been legal. The regulations were clear. Humanity had no right to threaten military action over a legal operation. If humans cannot accept established law, they have no place among civilized species, Venth declared. Some council members agreed. Others started asking uncomfortable questions. How many species had been harvested over the years? Who decided which species were valid targets? The harvest regulations were 3,000 years old. Many current council members didn't even know they existed. On the Wellington, Captain White led a task force tracking the Crethian ships. Lieutenant Baker worked day and night following their trail. The Crethians had a weak head start, but they weren't hiding. They were traveling at normal speed toward their home system, completely confident in their legal protection. They think the law will protect them, Baker said. The law won't protect anyone from what's coming, White replied. Back on New Haven, Lisa Morgan organized the parents into groups. They demanded constant updates from Palmer. They wanted to know what Earth was doing. When would the military arrive? When would they get their children back? Palmer held daily meetings in the central square. He shared every bit of information he received. The parents clung to each update like a lifeline. Some of them had stopped eating. Others couldn't sleep. The grief was overwhelming, but underneath it, something else was building. Anger. A cold, focused rage directed at the species that had taken their children and the council that had allowed it. Whatever happens, Palmer told them, Earth is coming. The military is mobilizing. We're not accepting this. The words weren't enough. Nothing could be enough. But they gave people something to hold on to. Hope mixed with vengeance. The promise that someone would pay for what had been done. General Morrison assembled Earth's fleet at staging points throughout human space. New ships arrived daily. Carriers that hadn't finished their testing. Destroyers pulled from patrol duty. Even old vessels from the reserve fleet were reactivated and armed. It was the largest human fleet ever assembled. Compared to what the Council could bring to bear, it was still tiny. The Council had thousands of ships from hundreds of species. Earth had barely 100 warships, many of them outdated or incomplete. The math didn't matter anymore. Humanity was done calculating odds. They were going to war. Admiral Hayes took command of the fleet personally. She was 60 years old and had been planning to retire. Instead, she found herself preparing for the largest military operation in human history. She sent one final message to the Council before the fleet departed. You had a chance to do the right thing. You chose ancient laws over innocent children. Now you'll face the consequences. The fleet jumped to faster than light speed, heading for the last known position of the Crethian ships. Every human on every planet watched them go. Parents prayed. Politicians debated. Military families said goodbye to their loved ones. Everyone understood that the galaxy was about to change forever. The 3,000-year peace was ending, and humanity was the one ending it. Part 5. 10 years after the harvest at New Haven, Captain Danny White retired from military service. His hair had gone gray during the war years. His hands sometimes shook when he remembered the battles. He had been promoted 3 times and offered flag rank, but he declined every promotion beyond captain. The Wellington had been his ship, and being her captain was enough. White returned to Earth and accepted a teaching position at the Naval Academy. Young officers needed to understand what had happened and why. They needed to learn the lessons that had been paid for in blood. On his first day of class, White stood in front of 40 cadets and told them the story. He started with the morning the distress call came from New Haven. He described the trip to the colony and what he found there. He told them about tracking the Crethian ships and the decision to open fire against direct orders. The council said they had maintained peace for 3,000 years, White told his students. But it wasn't real peace. It was just an absence of challenge. Real peace requires justice, not just stability. Remember that when you're out there making decisions that matter. The cadets listened carefully. Some of them had been children during the war. They remembered the fear of those years and the relief when the children started coming home. Others were born after the war ended. For them, it was history. But White made sure they understood it was history that could repeat if people forgot. Lisa Morgan never returned to teaching at a school. The classroom reminded her too much of that day when the Crethians came. Instead, she became director of the New Haven Memorial Institute. The facility was built to document the histories of every species affected by harvest programs. The institute became a place of healing and remembrance. Survivors came to share their stories. Families came to honor those who didn't return. Lisa made sure every name was recorded. Every experience was preserved. The galaxy needed to remember what had happened so it would never happen again. One of the first exhibits showed the Crethian research notes. Visitors could read the clinical descriptions of procedures performed on children. They could see the equipment that had been used. They could understand exactly what the harvest programs meant in practice, not just in legal theory. People need to see this, Lisa told her staff, not to create anger, but to remember why we fought. Commander Helen Price never left the military. She established a new department called the Recovery Service. Its mission was to investigate reports of missing children throughout the free systems, alliance and respond with force when necessary. Price's teams operated under what became known as the Wellington Protocols. They were authorized to cross borders without permission. They could ignore local sovereignty when children's lives were at stake. The protocols were controversial but effective. In the first 5 years, the Recovery Service conducted 47 operations and returned 800 children to their families. Price personally led many of those missions. She had nightmares about the Crethian medical bay and the children she found there. The Recovery Service was her way of making sure she never saw that again. The Crethian Empire collapsed within 5 years of the war ending. Their economy had been built on genetic research funded by harvest programs. Without that foundation, and facing massive reparations demands from dozens of species, their government fell apart. Civil war broke out between factions trying to control what remained. Admiral Susan Hayes watched the Crethian collapse from her office on Earth. She felt no satisfaction. The Crethian people were suffering for decisions made by their leaders generations ago. Young Crethians who had nothing to do with the harvest programs were paying the price. War doesn't end when the fighting stops, Hayes told her aide. The consequences echo for decades. Remember that next time someone suggests military action as a simple solution. Hayes retired 2 years after the war ended. She spent her remaining years writing a detailed history of the conflict. The book became required reading at military academies throughout the Alliance. It was honest about the costs and the mistakes. Hayes didn't try to make humanity look heroic. She showed the war as it really was. Brutal, expensive, and traumatic for everyone involved. The Free Systems Alliance grew steadily. 212 species joined over the first decade. The old council still existed technically, but it was a shadow of its former power. The founding members either adapted to the new reality or found themselves increasingly isolated. The Valdran hierarchy, whose commander had first moved aside to let the human fleet pass, underwent major reforms. They investigated their own history and found evidence of 3 harvest operations conducted centuries ago. The Valdran government publicly apologized and paid reparations to the affected species. They joined the Free Systems Alliance 5 years after it formed. Other founding members were less willing to change. They retreated into their own space and maintained that the old ways were correct. The ancient laws had kept peace for millennia, they argued. Humanity had destroyed that peace out of emotional attachment to their young. But public opinion had shifted permanently. Citizens throughout the galaxy knew about the harvest programs now. They knew what the ancient laws had allowed. Support for the old council dwindled as more evidence emerged about how the founding members had maintained their power. Earth became known throughout the galaxy for 2 things: their military ferocity and their absolute commitment to protecting children of any species. Human ships patrolled Alliance space with one mission: make sure nothing like New Haven ever happened again. Some species resented the human presence. They saw Earth as aggressive and unwilling to compromise. Others welcomed the protection. They knew that humanity had proven they would fight when it mattered. On New Haven, the colony slowly rebuilt. The population grew as new families arrived, but it was never the same as before. Parents held their children closer. Security forces were expanded and better armed. Every ship approaching the planet was carefully scanned and questioned. Commander Jack Palmer remained in charge of colony security. He trained his people differently now. They ran drills for hostile landings. They practiced resistance tactics. Palmer made sure his security force could fight back if something like the harvest ever happened again. The memorial in the central square listed every name of every child taken. 2,300 names carved in stone. Some of those children had come home. Others never would. The memorial was a reminder of what had been lost and what had been worth fighting for. 20 years after the harvest, Ambassador Kyle Rogers addressed the Free Systems Alliance Council. He was old now, ready to retire. This would be his final speech as Earth's representative. "We joined the Galactic Council hoping to find peace among the stars," Rogers said. "What we found was a system built on ancient privileges and laws that valued order over justice. We fought a war to change that system. We lost ships and lives. We damaged our economy and traumatized our people. Was it worth it?" He paused and looked around the chamber. Representatives from 200 species watched him. Many of them had their own stories about the old council and the harvest programs. Ask the children who came home. Ask the families who were reunited. Ask the species who no longer live in fear that their young will be legally taken. Yes, it was worth it. The cost was terrible, but the alternative was accepting evil simply because it was written into law. The chamber stood and applauded. Not everyone agreed with everything humanity had done. The methods had been brutal. The disregard for established procedure had set concerning precedents. But nobody could deny the fundamental truth. The old system had been wrong, and someone had to be willing to challenge it. Rogers retired to Earth and spent his final years writing his memoirs. He was honest about the diplomatic failures that led to war. He questioned some of the military decisions, but he never regretted the core choice: fight or accept that children could be harvested under legal protection. 30 years after the harvest, a new generation grew up who had never known the old council. They learned about it in history classes. They studied the harvest protocols as examples of how laws could be used to justify terrible things. They were taught the Wellington Protocols as the correct response to injustice. Some historians began to question whether the war had been necessary. Could diplomacy have worked? Could reforms have been achieved without violence? The debates were fierce in academic circles. Captain White, now retired and in his 70s, was invited to speak at a university symposium on the topic. A young professor argued that humanity had been too quick to resort to military action, that patience and negotiation would have achieved the same results without the bloodshed. White listened patiently. Then he stood and spoke quietly. "The Crethians were conducting medical procedures on children when we caught up with them. Every hour we waited was another hour those kids suffered. Tell me which ones we should have sacrificed for more diplomatic meetings. Give me their names. Explain to their parents why it was more important to follow proper procedure than to save their children." The room went silent. The theoretical argument collapsed when confronted with the reality. Sometimes moral choices come down to simple questions. Do you act now to stop harm, or do you follow process and hope it works out eventually? Part 4 of the Galactic Council meeting lasted 3 days. Representatives from hundreds of species argued about laws and regulations and what humanity had done. Some demanded immediate punishment. Others wanted to investigate the harvest protocols more carefully. The chamber divided along lines that had been forming for centuries, but nobody had talked about openly. Younger species looked at the harvest laws and realized they could be targets too. The regulations didn't just apply to humans. Any species classified as newly spacefaring could be legally harvested by founding members. For 3,000 years, the powerful species had maintained this right, and the weaker ones had simply accepted it because that was how things were done. Admiral Susan Hayes didn't wait for the Council to make a decision. She assembled Earth's full military force at the edge of Council space: 118 warships, 6 assault carriers, support vessels, and supply ships. It was still small compared to what the Council could deploy, but it was every combat-capable ship humanity owned. "We're going to the Crethian home system," Hayes announced at the command briefing. Her senior officers listened carefully. They all knew this was unprecedented. The Council had never faced a direct military challenge from a member species. "Our objective is simple," Hayes continued. "Return every child they've taken. Destroy every facility they've used for these harvests. Anyone who tries to stop us will be treated as hostile." General Frank Morrison was with the fleet personally. His flagship, the Liberty, was the most powerful vessel Earth had ever built. It carried enough weapons to level a city and enough armor to survive almost anything. Morrison had helped design it years ago, back when humanity was still trying to prove themselves to the Council. Now they were preparing to use it against Council members. The Council dispatched a peacekeeping fleet to block the human advance. 300 ships from 12 different species. The force was led by Fleet Commander Zek of the Valdran hierarchy. Zek was a military legend with 40 years of experience in Council operations. He had fought in border wars and peacekeeping missions throughout the galaxy. He expected the humans to back down when faced with overwhelming numbers. His communication to Admiral Hayes was formal and professional. Earth Fleet, you are ordered to withdraw immediately. Continuing your advance will be considered an act of war against the Galactic Council. Turn back now, or we will be forced to open fire. Hayes sent back an equally formal response. You are protecting species that experiment on children. Move aside or go through us to defend them. The two fleets faced each other across empty space, 300 Council ships against 118 human vessels. Commander Zek studied the tactical display and ran probability calculations. Any military engagement would result in the complete destruction of the human fleet. It would be a massacre, but it would also mean destroying an entire species' military in one battle. The political consequences would be enormous. Public opinion throughout Council space was already shifting as more evidence emerged about the harvest programs. If Zek opened fire on humans trying to rescue children, it would create a crisis the Council might never recover from. They're not bluffing, Zek's tactical officer reported. Their weapons are hot. Shields at maximum. They've arranged their fleet for an alpha strike pattern. Zek understood what he was seeing. The humans had positioned their ships to cause maximum damage in the opening moments of battle. They would lose, but they would take dozens of Council ships with them. It was a suicide tactic designed to make the cost of stopping them too high. Commander Zek had spent his entire life serving the Council. He believed in the laws and the peace they had maintained. But as he looked at the tactical display and thought about what those laws allowed, something shifted in his thinking. After 6 hours of standoff, Zek did something he never thought he would do. He ordered his fleet to move aside. The Council erupted in outrage. Commander Zek was immediately recalled, court-martialed, and stripped of his rank. But the damage was done. 3 more peacekeeping fleets received orders to stop the human advance. All 3 commanders found reasons not to engage. The truth spread through Council military channels quickly. Nobody wanted to be responsible for wiping out a species trying to rescue their children. Admiral Hayes led the human fleet to the Crethean home system. The trip took 60 days. During that time, more evidence emerged about the extent of the harvest programs. Council species started investigating their own records. What they found was horrifying. The Cretheans hadn't just taken children from New Haven. They had been conducting harvests for 800 years. 19 different species. Thousands of subjects, all of it legal under regulations that most Council members didn't even know existed. When the human fleet arrived at the Crethean home system, they found it heavily defended. The Cretheans had called in their allies and activated military installations that had protected their space for 2,000 years. Defensive platforms covered every approach. Battle stations orbited the primary planet. Fighter squadrons patrolled the outer system. General Morrison stood on the bridge of the Liberty and studied the defenses. His tactical team had been planning this assault for weeks. They had simulated hundreds of scenarios. The numbers were bad. Even with surprise and superior weapons technology, the cost of breaking through would be severe. All ships, this is Morrison. Begin the attack. The Liberty led the assault. Its main guns opened fire on the nearest defensive platform. The shots hit with devastating force, tearing through shields that were supposed to be impenetrable. Carrier groups launched fighter wings that moved faster and hit harder than anything in Council space. The battle for the Crethean home system lasted 8 days. Human forces bypassed military targets whenever possible. They weren't there to conquer territory. They were there to find children and destroy the facilities that had experimented on them. Commander Helen Price led ground assault teams to compound after compound. Each one revealed more evidence of what the Cretheans had been doing. Laboratory complexes built specifically for genetic research, holding facilities designed to house subjects from multiple species. Medical equipment that had been used on thousands of beings over centuries. They found children from 19 different species. Some had been held for decades. The Cretheans kept detailed records of every subject. Price read through the files and felt sick. Names, ages, species, procedures performed, results. Some files had a notation at the end. Subject expired. Clinical language for murdered children. Captain Danny White's team discovered a central archive building. It contained 800 years of research data. White called in technical specialists to secure the information. The evidence was overwhelming. The Harvest program had been operating continuously since before most current council members even joined. Lisa Morgan had joined the fleet as a civilian advisor. She worked with the rescue teams helping recovered children. Many of them were traumatized beyond anything she had seen. Some couldn't speak. Others had been changed so fundamentally they barely remembered who they had been. They made it legal, Lisa said quietly as she stood in one of the research facilities. They wrote laws that let them do this for centuries. The evidence spread through council space faster than the Crethians could contain it. Species that had trusted the founding members for thousands of years suddenly questioned everything. The Harvest protocols became public knowledge. Citizens throughout the galaxy learned that their children could be legally taken under ancient regulations. 23 species formally withdrew from the council within a month. The political structure that had maintained peace for 3,000 years was collapsing. The founding members tried to defend the laws, but the evidence was too strong. Public opinion had turned decisively against them. Admiral Hayes issued a demand to every council member. Return any human children in your custody. Provide documentation of all harvest operations conducted in the last century. Species that cooperated would be left alone. Those that refused would face the same treatment as the Crethians. The threat was clear. Humanity had proven they were willing to fight. They had attacked one of the most powerful empires in council space and won. Other species began to realize that the ancient laws couldn't protect them anymore. 12 more species came forward with evidence of their own harvest programs. They offered full cooperation in exchange for immunity from human retaliation. Admiral Hayes accepted their offers but made one thing clear. The facilities would be destroyed. Every single one. The war continued for another 6 months. Human forces attacked harvest facilities throughout council space. They returned children to their home species. They destroyed equipment and burned research notes. Everywhere they went, they left behind ruins and the message that this would never happen again. But the cost was severe. Earth lost 41 ships and 8,000 personnel. Captain White's Wellington was heavily damaged in a battle near the Crethian core worlds. Commander Price lost half her assault team in a ground engagement. Admiral Hayes watched ships under her command get destroyed, knowing that every death was on her conscience. The human economy had been completely militarized. Civilian production stopped. Resources were redirected to the war effort.